Nancy Lee Dardy was born in 1948. She grew up in a close-knit Midwestern family in Minnesota. Those who knew her describe her as warm-hearted, generous, and fiercely dedicated to the people around her. She had a special way of lighting up a room, whether she was working, volunteering, or simply spending time with her loved ones. Nancy graduated from Chisholm High School in the mid-1960s and later pursued further studies in healthcare. She eventually became a licensed practical nurse, a role that perfectly suited her nurturing personality. She worked for years at a local medical facility in Chisholm, providing care and comfort to countless patients. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues remember her as someone who consistently went above and beyond, often staying late to help or simply listen. In addition to her professional life, Nancy was a mother, daughter, and friend. She had 2 children who were the center of her world. Though divorced, she maintained strong ties with her family and community. Her home was always open, a place where neighbors could stop in for a cup of coffee, and where her warmth and kindness filled every room. On the morning of the 16th of July, 1986, police in Chisholm were dispatched to Nancy's home to conduct a welfare check after she failed to show up for a scheduled appointment. What they found shocked the quiet Iron Range town. Nancy's lifeless body was discovered inside her home. Authorities said she had been brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Witnesses later reported hearing a woman scream in the early morning hours, but by the time anyone arrived, it was already too late. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension processed the crime scene and collected male DNA evidence. Although they were able to build a complete DNA profile, it didn't match anyone in the national database at the time. The case quickly grew cold, leaving Nancy's family and friends devastated and without closure. Over the decades, investigators interviewed and collected DNA samples from more than 100 people. Nancy's children, now grown, held on to hope that one day justice would be served. They were determined to keep her memory alive and never let her case be forgotten. Nancy's daughter once told reporters, "She was our everything, our mother, our friend, our guide. We just want to know who did this and why." Despite years of heartbreak and dead ends, the family remained steadfast. They attended community events, stayed in contact with law enforcement, and continued to advocate for progress in the investigation. Their patience and persistence were eventually rewarded. In 2020, new hope emerged when investigators revisited the DNA evidence using modern technology. They approached Michael Allen Carbo Jr., who had lived in Chisholm at the time of the murder. Carbo voluntarily submitted a DNA sample, and it was a match. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension confirmed that Carbo's DNA was identical to the male DNA recovered from Nancy's body and the crime scene back in 1986. It was the breakthrough that investigators and Nancy's family had been waiting for. Carbo was arrested in July 2020 and charged with first-degree murder. In 2022, a jury found him guilty of killing Nancy Dardy while committing criminal sexual conduct. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Daugherty family, it was a long-awaited step toward justice. But just 2 years later, in May 2024, the Minnesota Supreme Court overturned Carbo's conviction. The court ruled that the original trial judge had unjustly denied Carbo's defense team the right to introduce evidence of a possible alternative suspect. The decision stunned Nancy's family and the public, forcing the case back into the courtroom. Carbo's retrial began on the 13th of January, 2025. The prosecution once again leaned heavily on the DNA evidence, while the defense argued that another person was responsible for the crime. They insisted that Carbo was innocent and that the state had ignored leads that pointed elsewhere. Despite the intense scrutiny and emotional toll, Nancy's children attended the trial, determined to see it through. St. Louis County Attorney Kim Mackey said, "Our thoughts go out to the family of Nancy Dardy. This has been a long road to justice. The family of Miss Nancy has shown the utmost strength, and we thank them for their support from the beginning to the end." In January 2025, a second jury found Carbo guilty once more. His resentencing was scheduled for the 4th of March, 2025. However, shortly before the hearing, Carbo's legal team filed a motion for acquittal with Judge Robert Friday on the 14th of February. They are now seeking a third trial. Carbo's defense continues to argue that he was wrongly convicted and that another person took Nancy Dardy's life. The prosecution, meanwhile, maintains that the DNA evidence is irrefutable and directly links Carbo to the crime. The case now reverts to district court, where a judge will determine whether the defense's request will be granted. The St. Louis County Attorney's Office has stated that while it is disappointed by the delays, it remains committed to prosecuting Carbo and ensuring justice for Nancy. Nearly 4 decades after her tragic death, Nancy Dardy is remembered not just for how she died, but for how she lived. She was a devoted mother, a caring nurse, and a pillar of her community. Her kindness touched the lives of many, and her loss was deeply felt. The fight for justice has tested her family in ways few can imagine, but their love for Nancy and their hope has never wavered. Nancy Dardy's legacy lives on in the hearts of her children, her friends, her former patients, and a community that refused to let her be forgotten. Susan was a woman of determination with an unshakable passion for running. Living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, she found solace in the quiet morning runs she took before the world began to stir. Each day, she would lace up her shoes, put on her headphones, and lose herself in the rhythm of her footsteps. But on that October morning in 1994, her life would change forever. Born to a supportive, close-knit family, Susan was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her parents, who had always been active in their community, instilled in their children a sense of perseverance and resilience. Susan was a high school graduate, a bright and driven young woman who balanced her academic interests with an active lifestyle. She loved sports, especially running, which she had been doing since she was in middle school. She went on to attend the University of New Mexico, majoring in health and physical education. With her combination of athleticism and academic focus, she seemed destined for success. But no one could have predicted the nightmare that would unravel her future. That fateful morning in 1994, Susan had gone for her regular jog along a quiet trail near the Rio Grande Nature Center State Park in Albuquerque. The sun had just started to rise, and the air was cool and crisp, perfect for a morning run. She had no way of knowing that this run would be her last for a long time. As she jogged along the path, she was suddenly grabbed from behind by a man who violently assaulted her. The man raped her and left her badly injured, her life altered in an instant. The aftermath was shattering. When Susan managed to escape her attacker, she immediately sought help and was rushed to the hospital. The police were called, and forensic examiners collected the crucial evidence, a rape kit that would later hold the key to her attacker's identity. Despite her bravery in providing a description of the man who assaulted her, the investigation stalled, and the case quickly went cold. For years, Susan's attacker remained unidentified, and though detectives continued to investigate, the case was ultimately placed on the back burner. Susan, however, was not someone to give up easily. Though the physical injuries took time to heal, the emotional scars ran much deeper. Over the years, Susan worked hard to regain control of her life. She became an advocate for sexual assault survivors, using her voice to spread awareness. She even started attending therapy, helping others find their own healing, while continuing to run in memory of her former self, the woman she once was before her attacker stole her peace. Susan passed away in 2013, 19 years after the brutal assault. Her family, forever changed by the attack, still hoped for justice. But with her death, the chance for her to see her assailant convicted seemed to slip further away. The assault kit, however, was still sitting untouched, an untested piece of evidence that would later become critical to the case's resolution. The turning point came in 2020 when police began re-examining old sexual assault cases in light of new forensic technologies, including advances in DNA analysis. Susan's case was one of the many that was finally revisited. Her assault kit, previously left untested, was submitted for DNA analysis. 2 years later, in 2022, a DNA match was made to Gilbert Contreras, an Albuquerque man with a lengthy criminal history. Contreras had been on law enforcement's radar for years. He was known for his violent tendencies and had been arrested numerous times for violent offenses. Born and raised in Albuquerque, his childhood was marked by instability and violence. He dropped out of high school early and spent much of his adult life in and out of the criminal justice system. By the time his DNA was matched to Susan's case, Contreras was already serving time for unrelated charges. The discovery of Contreras' DNA in connection with the 1994 assault led to his arrest in 2022, and by 2024, the case was moving toward trial. On the 25th of November, 2024, a jury found him guilty of 2 counts of criminal penetration and kidnapping. The prosecution presented a compelling case, emphasizing the brutality of the assault. Prosecutor Jack Bennett described the violent nature of the crime during the sentencing hearing, detailing the attack. He beat her, kicked her, forced her to a secluded area by the river in the brush, and brutally and violently assaulted her. Naked, bound, and still gagged, she waited. She played lifeless. She tried to seem unconscious until she felt like she could start to work her way back toward the trail she had been running on that day. She had been beaten with a rock, tied with strips of her own clothing, and she was indecently assaulted twice. A statement from the woman who had come across Susan in the aftermath of the assault was read to the court. Her face was twice the swelling of the normal face. Her eyes were like little slits. She had big bruises and blood coming down her mouth. The jury also heard from Susan's daughter, who shared the pain of losing her mother to the trauma of the assault, and stated that her mother had passed away before ever seeing justice. 30 years is not quick, said Susan's daughter, Laura. I lost hope for justice long ago. He doesn't care about his victims. He doesn't care at all. In the trial's closing arguments, defense attorney Adam argued that there were significant issues with the investigation, pointing to the lapses in the 1994 investigation and the subsequent handling of evidence. He suggested there could have been a consensual relationship between the victim and Contreras. The prosecution firmly rejected that claim, stating, "It was not mentioned in opening, and there is no evidence of it." As the sentencing phase neared, the prosecution urged for a maximum sentence of 72 years due to the violent nature of the crime and Contreras' criminal history. The defense, however, argued for a sentence between 15 to 20 years, pointing to the fact that Contreras was nearing his 60s and had already spent much of his life in prison. On the 6th of March, 2025, Judge Courtney Weeks sentenced Gilbert Contreras to 54 years in prison acknowledging his extensive criminal history and the extreme violence of the crime. The judge emphasized that Contreras would likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. There is a long felony history. There is a history of violent crime with Mr. Contreras. I do not think the court has to reiterate that this is an extremely violent and an extremely heinous case. Though Susan's family finally saw justice, the pain of losing her and of her never seeing the conclusion of the case lingered. Still, they found solace in knowing that Susan's case had been resolved and that Gilbert Contreras would never harm another victim again. Susan's legacy, one of resilience and courage, continues to inspire others, proving that justice can sometimes be delayed, but it is never denied.
The investigation into Jason Reutder's death quickly turned cold after the initial flurry of activity in 2005. Despite the best efforts of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, the case seemed to stall at every turn. The mystery surrounding Jason's murder left his family in a constant state of uncertainty, but their resolve to uncover the truth never wavered. Below is a breakdown of key events over the years as the case, initially forgotten by many, gradually came back into focus. On August 6, 2005, Jason Reutder's life was tragically taken from him. His body was discovered in his Salt Lake City area home, with clear signs of multiple stab wounds. The lack of forced entry, coupled with the cryptic argument overheard by a neighbor, left investigators with very few leads. Jason Mitchell Reutder was far more than a name in a cold case file. He was a devoted father of two, celebrated for his creative spirit and a razor-sharp, often horribly funny sense of humor. His talent for doodling, whether on old newspapers or the walls of the garage, never failed to spark laughter, especially from his sisters, Nikki Price and Stephanie Pershon. Despite finding a bloodied knife with Jason's DNA at the scene, authorities couldn't identify a suspect. The DNA found at the scene, which included both Jason's and an unidentified individual's, was entered into CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. But it yielded no matches. Jason's family and friends were devastated. His loved ones even bought space on billboards along the highway, pleading for tips. A $5,000 reward was offered by the Unified Police Department. But the case, despite these efforts, grew cold. For months, the investigation seemed to be on track but quickly faded as new leads failed to emerge. For several years, the case seemed to fall into the abyss of unsolved crimes. Investigators re-examined the evidence from time to time, but as the years passed, leads continued to evaporate. There was no sign of a motive, and although police received occasional tips, they went nowhere. For Jason's family, these were years of frustration and heartache. They remained in constant contact with the authorities, holding on to the hope that one day, someone would provide them with the closure they so desperately needed. By 2011, it was evident that Jason's case had gone cold. However, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office had not forgotten about him. New investigators were assigned to the case, and cold case protocols began to kick in. Yet, with the passage of time, the lack of new evidence or reliable leads stymied their progress. The case was essentially at a standstill. It wasn't until 2014 that the Sheriff's Office began to review its entire cold case strategy. The hope was that newer investigative techniques, such as DNA testing, might help uncover fresh clues. However, this period of renewed interest did not yield immediate results. Jason's family, still steadfast in their search for justice, leaned on each other during these years of waiting, refusing to let the case fade into oblivion. Jason's sisters continued their efforts, remaining in regular contact with law enforcement. "I know this could have stalled, but they would not stop until it was done," said Nikki Price. Their persistence mattered. In 2015, after nearly a decade of no progress, the case was handed over to the Salt Lake County Cold Case Unit. The detectives who inherited the case were driven by the hope that the latest forensic technologies could uncover crucial information. Jason's family, who had been vocal in their calls for justice, saw the transfer of the case to the Cold Case Unit as a sign of renewed commitment. However, even with the fresh perspective and resources of the Cold Case Unit, investigators found themselves back at square one. The lack of new evidence made it difficult to move forward, and the case continued to hang in limbo. For Jason's family, it was a period of both hope and despair, as they began to wonder if their beloved relative's murder would ever be solved. Over the years, the Reutder family kept fighting for answers, despite the case remaining inactive. They continued to advocate for their loved one, attending public meetings and trying to engage local media to keep their father's memory alive. The family's outreach efforts were tireless, hoping that a new approach or development would finally unearth the truth. Despite little public progress behind the scenes, law enforcement continued to re-examine every aspect of the case. Detectives sought out new ways of utilizing forensic tools, even revisiting DNA samples collected in the early stages of the investigation. However, advancements in technology still weren't enough to bring them closer to a suspect. Jason's family often revisited their personal memories of the man they loved, holding on to the belief that one day, someone would come forward with the truth. By 2020, investigators had begun to explore the application of advanced DNA technology, such as familial DNA searches. New forensic techniques, including genetic genealogy, allowed law enforcement to identify potential familial links to suspects through databases. Although still in its infancy, this technology represented a game changer for cold cases. It provided a glimmer of hope for cases like Jason's, where traditional investigative methods had failed. However, despite the promise of new technology, Jason's case did not see a breakthrough this year. The hope that these new methods would provide a viable lead continued to push the investigation forward, but the Reutder family still struggled with their grief. They continued to hold their vigil for justice, never allowing the case to slip from public awareness. In late 2021, the Utah law enforcement community launched the innovative Cold Case Playing Cards initiative. The cards, which featured victims' faces and case details, were distributed in jails and prisons across the state, with the goal of generating new leads or encouraging individuals with information to come forward. Jason's case was one of many included in the program. For his family, this was a new source of hope, even if it didn't immediately yield any new tips. In 2022, in a creative and desperate attempt to bring attention to Utah's cold cases, the Unified Police Department launched a campaign using a deck of playing cards. Each card featured a photo and details of a missing person or homicide victim. Jason Reutder's case was among them. The deck was distributed in jails and prisons, the idea being that inmates might recognize a name or a face and come forward with information. The initiative wasn't guaranteed to work, but for Jason's sisters, it was another chance. "It might shake up some dirt," said Stephanie Pershin, "and that's exactly what we need." Despite the passage of years, the Playing Cards campaign represented a turning point. It kept Jason's case in the public eye and renewed interest in solving the crime. For the Reutder family, it symbolized their continued fight for justice and their refusal to let Jason be forgotten. It wasn't until 2024 that a breakthrough in the case finally arrived. The Utah Bureau of Forensic Services flagged DNA from a separate case, linked to Mark Nelson Munoz, who had been arrested in another state. Munoz's DNA matched the evidence found at Jason Reutder's crime scene. This match led detectives back to Munoz, who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. The DNA breakthrough proved that advancements in forensic science, especially DNA matching, could breathe new life into cold cases. It allowed investigators to close in on a suspect after years of frustration. However, even with the discovery of Munoz's identity, the task of locating him proved to be difficult. He was known to be unhoused and had a transient lifestyle, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track him down. On January 23, 2025, after years of pursuit, Mark Nelson Munoz was apprehended in connection with the 2005 murder of Jason Reutder. His arrest marked a long-awaited and emotional moment for Jason's family. After nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and pain, they finally saw a glimmer of hope that justice was within reach. Munoz was charged with first-degree felony murder, though details surrounding his motive remain unclear. The Reutder family felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Jason's son, Andrew, who was only a child when his father was killed, expressed that it felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I just feel so much better," he said, reflecting on the years of anger and grief that had consumed him. His aunts echoed that sentiment. Stephanie Pershin said, I just want to say how much of a relief this is. It has been a long 20 years. Detective Ben Pendern, who worked the cold case, and Salt Lake County Sheriff Rosie Rivera both addressed the public. Rivera stated, "This arrest is a testament to the dedication and commitment of our detectives who never gave up on finding justice for Jason Reutder." District Attorney Sim Gill emphasized that the legal process was only beginning, but expressed hope that the charges would help the family begin to heal. As of 2025, the investigation into Jason's murder remains active. Detectives continue to seek any further evidence that may shed light on the motive behind the killing. While Mark Munoz has been arrested, he has not been cooperative with authorities, making it difficult for investigators to understand the reasons behind Jason's death. The case, which had remained dormant for nearly 20 years, is once again a focal point of law enforcement's attention. While justice may have taken decades to arrive, the Reutder family has expressed deep gratitude that their beloved Jason's case has finally seen progress. "It has been a long 20 years," said Jason's sister, Stephanie, reflecting on the emotional toll the case has taken on their family. Though the family's grief is far from over, the arrest of Mark Munoz brings them one step closer to understanding why Jason's life was taken so senselessly.